Arbella Early Edition is presented by Arbella Insurance. Here for New England sports fans. Here for good.
Members of the Boston Celtics, including Enes Kanter, Vincent Poirier, and Marcus Smart, taking part in peaceful protests in Boston yesterday. The players, along with thousands of others, speaking out following the death of George Floyd, who was killed by a Minneapolis police officer last week. Unfortunately, those protests turned violent later in the night. 40 arrests were made, and 7 Boston police officers were hospitalized as looting and destruction filled the streets of Boston. Welcome to Arbella's Early Edition, of course, with Trenni. We got Tom E, Curran and Draper and Sherrod Blakely joining us. And, I mean, I'm overwhelmed and have just been looking for answers. And I don't know. I'm just going to open up the floor. Kyle, let's start with you.
Well, Gary, you know, we exchanged emails, all of us earlier today, and I'll tell you, you know, I'm frustrated. And this has been building not only the last 6 days, but really, let's think about it, you know, last 20 years for me. I'm frustrated at the direction of our country. I'm frustrated and angry about the way African Americans are treated, not only by the police, not only by institutions, but by people every day. And, you know, the George Floyd murder just, you know, reiterates my frustration. And here's why I say this, guys. It's because I feel like me as a black man and black men in general, for some reason, people fear us out there. And it's frustrating to me. It's angry to me. You know, I've had discussions with friends, with neighbors, and instead of coming together and coming up with some solutions, I feel we're being pushed even further apart. And, you know, I need to know some answers. I want answers, you know, and that's what's so frustrating to me because, and I said it in the email, I think all of us on this show, you know, we just want to come together. We just want everybody to be happy, love, and respect each other. And I'm not sure how we do it in the United States of America. Sherrod, do you have any thoughts? I'm sure you do.
I have lots of thoughts, but and most of them not good. I guess as for me, this has been the George Floyd death was not as shocking to me as it was to a lot of people. And to me, that's sad that I've seen this movie many times before. African-American is arrested, African-American dies. A few weeks later, same script, different characters. And it's maddening. I mean, to Kyle's point, I think about something that one of my high school teachers told me a long time ago, and it was a Gandhi saying about, you know, be the change that you want to be. And so for me and for a lot of people that I grew up with, we wanted to be better than whatever other people thought we were supposed to be. And even when you do that, I still run into, you know, older white people who clutch their purses when I'm nearby, even though I know I make way more money than they do. And it's frustrating and maddening that no matter what we do, no matter what you accomplish, there seems to be this perception that you're still not good enough or equal to. And when you see the disproportionate treatment of African Americans by some police officers, that only reinforces that point.
Sherrod and Kyle, I think what a lot of us have struggled with this week, I'll be quite frank, a lot of white people, is how have we contributed to this? And how do we become better allies as colleagues, as friends? You know, all of the three of us text today. We want, as Kyle said, we want to be part of the change. And so, Sherrod, I'll start with you this time. What is the best way that, you know, we and people watching at home can help enact change that is long overdue?
Well, I think the first thing that has to start happening is we have to, I think white people have to do something that they've never really had to do, and that is become comfortable with being uncomfortable. Having those conversations that, frankly, they're just not comfortable having. Talk about racism. Racism is a disease. When you look at looting, you look at rioting, those are the symptoms of the disease. If you don't address the disease, you can't deal with the symptoms in an appropriate manner and eradicate them. And that's one of the biggest issues I have with. And so as an ally, I would just say that there has to be more conversations and real conversations about racism. because that is at the root of all these problems that we're looking at throughout the police department and the rioting and the looting and all that. That's the root of the problem.
Yeah, and I think, accountability also, Sherrod, Trenni, Gary, and Curran, we talk about, a world where everyone's equal, but yet when we go to the ballot box and cast our votes, some of us vote for people who are all about, dividing us. And so I think we need to hold everyone accountable, not only the police officers, not only the mayors, not only the president, not only the legislatures, but, if you see racism, call it out, hold that person accountable. We saw it in Central Park there in New York with the young man, the woman threatened him by calling the police because he was African American. We need to hold people accountable, and not just Black people. Black people can't be the only one upset and frustrated by this. I need all people to feel our pain and to actually be upset and frustrated and hold other people accountable.
We got two great columns up on NBC Sports Boston.com right now, one by Tom Curran, the other by John Tomasi. And Tom wrote something that I experienced over the weekend. And Tom, why don't you explain your column? Because it was on the money.
Yeah, really, after Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown in the earlier part of the last decade, we heard a lot of, it's time for white people to shut up and listen. And I think we all took that to heart. We've done too much listening and too much marginalizing and almost insidiously finding ways to stay away from the conversation if we weren't comfortable. Somebody must have done something, or I have friends who are police officers, or look at these statistics, people here in New England, the cops up here, it's not like it is in Minnesota or Texas or Florida or Arizona. We're missing the point. And we're missing the point last night if we get caught up on the looting and the rioting and miss the 30,000 or 40,000 people who are there for a very specific reason and don't align ourselves with them and say, well, I didn't like what happened late, so I'm not going to say anything. So I felt it was important. And Brian Flores of the Dolphins said, look, if you're comfortable talking about what Colin Kaepernick did wrong, or you have an issue with what Colin Kaepernick did, where are you on George Floyd? Because it's real easy to talk about George Floyd, but no one's doing it. And I thought that was him pointing a finger directly at me and saying, you're a coward and you're a hypocrite. You better say something. So I think maybe if people my age who look like me start to step up and stop being such cowards about it and wondering, oh, what are my neighbors going to say? Relax, say what you feel.
And Tom, to your point, I mean, that's when I talk about being comfortable with being uncomfortable. Those conversations, that type of dialogue, those discussions, that's the only way this is ever going to get better. People have to, and particularly white people, you have to have these conversations. And it's not going to be nearly as contentious or as vitriol as you might think, because there is a certain level of appreciation for candor. You would be surprised at the straight no chaser conversations that Black people are more than open to having. And until we get to a point where we can sit at the table and have those conversations and not feel threatened or feel as though, we're in this contentious back and forth battle, we're not going to fix this. Some
of it is people like me who look like me or are my age who know it's wrong to say something when I hear someone say something that doesn't involve a Black person at all. There's not a Black person in the room and somebody says something, or I make a joke or allude to something or don't speak up. That's where we have to get some of that institutional stuff out. Again, I don't want to hold too much court here, but that's where the onus is. I can talk to you all day long and then still walk out and somebody makes a crack and I don't say anything. That's a thing to do.
Yeah, guys, and real quick, I was thinking about this earlier. We talk about police officers, and there are some good police officers, but the main enemy of good police officers should be bad police officers, right? Because the officer in Minneapolis who killed George Floyd is giving a bad look to all police officers, and so it needs to start within police officers and police houses and police unions to weed out the bad guys. And that's where I go back to accountability. It's not up to just me, Sherrod, you guys. It's up to everyone. If you really want to see some change, if you really want to stop the protesting, stop the riots, we got to start holding everyone accountable for racism.
Yeah, I mean, just listening. I mean, I'll be honest, listening to Sherrod and Kyle talk at the top of the segment, I had to choke back tears because as well as I know them, to know the pain that they feel. And if that doesn't hit people in the heart and make them understand and realize this situation, I don't know what will. And I think, you know, I applaud Curran for having the courage to write that column and to say, I was wrong. You know, what I've done in the past is not helping the situation. And I think it is on all of us to speak up, you know, and also to advocate. You know, we have an opening at our office, or we're talking about, you know, lifting up all people, really lifting up people of all races, all colors, all backgrounds, so that there is a diversity of thought and a diversity of backgrounds in our friendships, our families, and our workplaces. Because until that happens, it's hard to be together when you're constantly separated by those boundaries.
I'm going to play editor-in-chief for a moment, but Curran's got a great article up at NBCSportsBoston.com. Tomasi does as well. Everybody should read it. If Kyle's comfortable, I think he should take his email from this morning and place that online as well. That's if you're comfortable, but I think that needs to be put out to the world.
Boston Sports Tonight is presented by Town Fair Tire. Every brand at the guaranteed lowest price. Nobody beats Town Fair Tire. Nobody.
All right, welcome into BST. This one's going to feel a little bit different. Yesterday began with peaceful protests across the country. Some later in the night. Those turned unfortunate, a little bit ugly. On Saturday, meanwhile, you had Jaylen Brown driving 15 hours to his hometown of Atlanta to join the protest down there. And yesterday, you had Marcus Smart and his cancer, Vincent Poirier, taking part in the Boston protests. Both Jaylen and Marcus talking about their reasoning and their experiences.
What do we want? Justice! What do we want? Justice! What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now!
We wanted to come out here and let our voice be heard because we stand for the truth and we stand for justice, and we won't stop until we get justice, and that's really what this is about. And you know, I just want to say to everyone who thinks this is something more than it is, it's not. You know, despite color or gender, the truth is the truth, justice is justice, and justice hasn't been served, and people are pissed off about it.
All right, what's up and welcome. It's Town Fair Tire Boston Sports Tonight. Tom Giles, Michael Holley, DJ Bean, Sherrod Blakely. Gentlemen, the first thing I want to start with is I heard a lot of people talking about the protest last night and the rioting and the looting that happened afterwards and just kind of grouping it all together. I think it's important, before we even have this conversation, to separate the two. That you had 2-3 hours of peaceful protest, which I was really proud of for Boston as a city. And then the rioting and the looting that happened afterwards, just a couple hundred people compared to the tens of thousands of people that had the peaceful protest. I think it's important to separate those two. Michael Holley, I'll start with your thoughts on the weekend.
Yeah, Tom Giles, I'm glad you started with that distinction because I think it's important to separate the two. On one hand, you have a lot of people who are protesting peacefully. They have their eyes on what the important thing is. And then there are some people who just want to go out there for whatever reason. Maybe they are unhappy, they're discontent with their lives in general, and they will use this as an opportunity to be violent. But I think the number one thing is an injustice happened. And as Martin Luther King said many years ago, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And I'm looking for us as a nation to take that next step, to get to that next level. When I first moved to Boston in 1994, I'm a Pearl Jam fan for many reasons, but Pearl Jam had a song, and it was talking about, it was referencing a guy in Detroit named Melise Green, who was killed by police. That was in the 1990s. And then you move up to 2000, Amadou Diallo in New York was killed by police. And so we've had this conversation, but, you know, Sherrod, I'm looking for not just a conversation and not just listening. We got to confront the real problem, which is brutality and racism.
You're right. But that's really what that's the root of the problem, which we tend to skirt around, dance around, and focus more on the symptoms, like rioting, looting, protesting, rather than get to the issues at hand. And that's really why this problem is one that has not shown much, if any, signs of just letting up. You know, as you guys know, I met up with Marcus Smart yesterday before the protests around about 6:45, and we spent, you know, a good hour and a half just kind of walking and talking. And the one thing that jumped out to both of us that was really, it resonated, was the number of folks who were protesting who weren't black. That, when you think back to all the great things that Martin Luther King Jr. did in terms of protesting, you start looking at those crowds and taking a closer glance at them. When the momentum of the civil rights movement really began to take momentum, it wasn't just a black movement, it was a civil rights movement. And if what we're seeing now, if there is going to be significant change, it has to be all hands on deck. And I think we're starting to see some signs of that. And it's good to see guys like Marcus Smart and Jaylen Brown and Enes Kanter use their platforms to amplify this movement. But it can't just be players. It can't just be black people. It has to be a much more collective effort. And I think we're starting to see, you know, the seeds of that right now starting to be planted.
Yeah, Sherrod, I was sad watching early edition, whether it be after Eric Garner, after George Floyd, whoever I'm talking to, my dad, white friends, a thing that will repeat something like, how could he just do that? Or how could the officers just stand there? And when I watch early edition, you very matter-of-factly said, I wasn't surprised watching that George Floyd video. So a lot of white people, for lack of a better term, playing catch-up and really understanding the injustice that's going on, thinking, how has my worldview maybe been a little skewed? What can I do differently? How can I change? How can I be a better friend, a better ally? It's devastating that the term ally even exists, because it suggests that there is a side that needs teammates and that needs partners, when obviously we should all be in this thing together. So I see the turnout, and Giles, you said it. You watch the first 3 hours, black, white, the group of people there, extremely peaceful, extremely respectful. And you see the earlier portions of these protests throughout the country. There's videos of policemen joining with protesters and demonstrating that, look, we're trying to be all in this together. And then the stuff happens afterwards that, as you said, a much smaller group that really gives the crowd that wants to discredit this whole thing all the ammunition they need, which is devastating.
And just, DJ, just to kind of piggyback on your point, you know, as you mentioned earlier, I did say, you know, it didn't shock me. And to be frank with you, I mean, that was the turning point for me in this whole process, where the pain was just, it became incredibly real. I've witnessed my father pass away, see the last breath leave his body. I've had to cover one of my best friends who got killed on a basketball court. And I thought that would be as painful as my life would ever get. I was wrong. This is so much more painful, because it's to the point now where I can see something like, you know, Mr. Floyd with a knee in his neck for 526 seconds and not be impacted by that, numbed by it. And that's just, that's a level of pain that I never thought I would ever experience. And so, to your point, and to what we're talking about, allies have to step up. Can't just be a black thing. This can't just be an athlete's thing. It has to be a people thing. If we're going to get the systemic change that we're talking about, this country needs.
Yeah, it's certainly not a problem where you say it's just a black problem. It's not a black problem. It is a problem of justice. It is a perversion of justice. And so when you talk about what can people of other races do, and we had this conversation earlier, Tom, Giles, and you made a point, and you said about that point, I'm not going to get into the details of it. You said, but that's obvious. You were saying it. I just made an obvious point. I said, well, that's a significant step, because historically, juries, all white juries, have been unwilling to make the obvious point. Why did the LA riots happen? Because an all-white jury saw what we saw on videotape and said it was not a problem. I mentioned Amadou Diallo earlier, shot by 4 cops. He had his wallet. They said it was a gun. They shot him down in his apartment building, and they were acquitted. So how can you help? That is unacceptable. The violence from the police departments, that's unacceptable. But the juries have to say, no, that is not feasible. That is not believable. We're going to hold you accountable for what you did. And to this point, that has not happened enough in American history. We got to face it.
I wonder how much of that, too, goes back to leadership. And I feel like right now, I think we can all agree that we've definitely been missing out on leadership from the top down in this country. And it goes back to when COVID started, I thought that Adam Silver was one of the best leaders out there. And now I think, you just mentioned Jaylen Brown, Marcus Smart. This is a situation where maybe these athletes, we do need them to step up and fill that leadership void. And it's definitely, I know, Michael, you said it, it's different than what it was 25 years ago. These guys are stepping up willingly.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sherrod, I think you were covering sports at the same time I was. And, early 90s, these things would happen. There was no Twitter. There was no Instagram. There was no social media where it would keep going. And quite frankly, a lot of athletes at that time were not getting involved. A lot of the top athletes were not as active then as they are now. And I'm thankful for it. I'm really glad that people are not shutting up and dribbling, that they are being citizens, engaged citizens. And, we can learn a lot from them. We talk about athletes, how they should stick to sports. No, they shouldn't. And we shouldn't stick to our jobs either. We should do more and follow their lead.
And we'll get to Curran's column in the next block, but even Brian Flores put out that statement. Curran had a great column today if you didn't see it, and I texted him about it, and he said, I was just really impacted by what Brian Flores had to say. So for all, we kind of watered down the impact of using one's platform because we say it so much, but it clearly can have a profound impact.